So now that Khan and Saladin got their museum relics, here's where they stand in the current Season of Conquest meta. Looking at the bonuses, Genghis Khan's got an extra 10% defense and 100 skill damage factor, while Saladin got 10% attack and 10% march speed. So while the 10% defense is nice for Khan, when you look at his skills, none of his skills give him any sort of defensive stats, which is part of what his skill tree is high risk, high reward. However, the second he gets swarmed, even with this extra 10% damage defense, he's going to pretty much still melt. So it's not going to do a lot to help his viability, especially in Season of Conquest. With Saladin, the move speed is actually significant, I'd say, because with the 5% increased march speed here, that extra 10% puts him at the same march speed as William. And he's already pretty tanky, although maybe not as high damage. He takes less skill damage and is a little tankier, so you might see a slight spike in his use in the Season of Conquest. Welcome back to Museum Relics Reviewed. In this episode we have YSG and Minamoto. First, YSG. You get a 20% defense and 5% skill damage bonus at tier 2. While it's not health, the defense definitely helps with survivability, and the skill damage further helps his 5-target AoE, making him a viable secondary march pair and earning a solid A-. Next, we have Minamoto. Minamoto gets 30% defense and 30% attack at max level. However, Minamoto really needed health with this relic, as he has very little defensively going for him and loses a skill to barbarian skills, making him very vulnerable. And as much as the relic is nice for PvE and barbarians, it's not necessarily enough to make him valuable, making him a solid B for his utility. Welcome to another episode of Museum Relics Reviewed and Rise of Kingdoms. In this episode we have Martel and Mehmed. First, Martel. Martel gives 35% attack and a meager 10% health at tier 2. If these were swapped, it would be a godsend for him, giving him some survivability. But the lack of skill or smite damage in his kit doesn't really bring enough to the table on its own, especially when you have an augmented skill on expertise and a garrison skill for city only, giving you essentially 2 skills that are actually field useful, landing Martel at a meager C for his relic. Next we have Mehmed, who gets a massive 30% health and 10% skill damage at tier 2. This is an awesome return from Mehmed, and although it hasn't made him a full meta staple, it is exactly what a commander like him needs to keep up with the power creep in the game and to keep him somewhat relevant in the off-field meta, and gets a solid A from me. Welcome to another Museum Relic Review. In this episode we have Sid and Richard. First we have Sid. Sid gets 25% attack and a 300 skill damage bonus on his tier 2 relic. This is one of the worst relics overall, and the biggest need that Sid had was survivability. This relic provides none of it. With an archer march with 0 bonus health, no AoE, or no other way to deter people from being near him, this relic puts him at a meager D rank. Next, we have Richard. Richard gets a 15% march speed bonus and 6% counterattack bonus. While this does not by any means make him a meta commander in PvP, this has an interesting effect on his active skill, since his active skill slows enemies, keeping his mobility up and slowing enemies, making him an interesting off-meta 2nd or 3rd infantry march options if you're slowing down enemies in an ambush-style play at choke points, getting a decent B- when you add in his PvE viability. Welcome to another Museum Relic Review. In this episode we have Mulan and Alexander. First we have Mulan, who gets a 20% bonus to health and a 15% skill damage reduction in terms of skill damage taken. This works fairly well with Mulan's setup as a secondary commander buffer, adding additional tankiness and further extending her ability to support by staying alive as an off-main support march, giving her an A- based on the fit to the commander and how it can help bonus support marches to do better. Next, we have Alexander, who gets a 10% infantry defense and a 3% normal attack damage taken reduction with no tier 2 level. While this is not quite what is needed to return him to the front of the support meta, the survivability is nothing I will turn my nose up to, and when used as a secondary commander, it gives a free bonus survivability to your buff march and keeps him very relevant with his damage taken debuff on his primary skill, earning a high B+ for this relic. Welcome to another episode of Museum Relic Review. In this episode we're reviewing Caesar and Frederick. First we have Caesar. Caesar gets a 20% damage boost and a 20% march speed bonus at tier 2, and while this would be an excellent relic for most commanders, Caesar suffers from not having a significant damage factor on any of his skills. Even with expertise, a 400 damage factor just does not do anything in the meta, making any sort of damage output difficult to get, even with the 20% bonus damage, and even with this relic. Netting this relic a base C. Good stats, just does not help an already very weak commander. Next, we have Frederick, who gets a 40% attack bonus and 15% skill damage taken reduction at tier 2. Similarly, this just doesn't do a lot for a commander who's already on weak footing and has no real survivability, where he could have used a damage reduction or a defense or health bonus, netting a low C- overall. Welcome to another episode of Museum Relics Reviewed in Rise of Kingdoms. First, we have Ragnar, who at rank 2 gets a very respectable 35% defense and 15% normal attack damage taken reduction. While the relic itself is good and makes him significantly tankier, because he doesn't have a decent damage factor on any of his skills, and you lose a skill to the rally base skill, which you're not going to be using him as a primary in rally anyway, it really can't pull him out of irrelevancy for gold key commanders, getting him a B-. While the execution was good, it just was not enough to make him supremely relevant among gold key commanders. Next, we have Thutmose, who gets a 25% attack and 20% health bonus at Relic Tier 2. This actually has a great effect, as he doesn't get a ton of direct stat bonus from his passive skills, so Relic gives him some extra survivability and damage to his passive heavy kit and gets an A- from me. Welcome to another episode of Museum Relic Review. In this episode, we're going over Constantine and Tomyris. First, we have Constantine. Constantine gets a 20% bonus to attack and a 5% bonus to normal damage with no Tier 2 relic. While this isn't groundbreaking, the bonus to normal attack damage and attack help boost damage output for his pairing with Gorgo, making him even stronger in a sneaky good Garrison pair, and earning an A- overall to help push him into the Garrison meta years after his release. And likely an A to A+ when he gets a second relic tier. Next, we have Tomyris, who gets 15% health and 10% march speed, and with no Tier 2 relic as well. The health is nice and a need for Tomyris, and the march speed is also a must-have to fill gaps in her kit. However, the stat level is just not enough to bring her to the forefront of relevance, and this relic gets a B-, which could become a B+ or A- with a Tier 2 level. Welcome to another episode of Museum Relics Reviewed. In this episode, we have Edward and Pyrrhus. First, we have Edward. Edward gets a 10% defense and 150 damage factor to his skill, with no Tier 2 relic level. This is an alright relic, it's just not nearly enough survivability or anything to help make him justifiably usable in the field. It would definitely yield much better results at Tier 2, and if the damage factor were replaced with damage reduction or counterattack damage, placing this relic at a plain C. Next, we have Pyrrhus, who gets 30% defense and 10% skill damage at Tier 2. This is honestly great, excellent survivability for a normal damage heavy kit, but it's not quite perfect, as a 10% skill damage wouldn't have quite the effect that the likes of 10% straight damage or 10% normal attack damage would, given his kit is so heavy on normal damage, and it would help increase his survivability this way, but it lands at a solid B+ overall.